Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for this very important event. My name is Mobashra Tazamal. I am the Associate Director of The.Bridge.Initiative. I'll be moderating our panel today on free speech, Islamophobia, and Palestine in academia. An event is co-sponsored by Bridge and the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Our panel today includes Professor John Esposito, Distinguished University Professor, Professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies. He's the founding director of the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and of the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown University. Dr. Esposito has published more than 55 books, and his writings have been translated into more than 50 languages. We also have Professor Aziz, who will be joining us shortly. She's a professor of law, Middle East legal studies, scholar, and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School. She's the author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, and the founding director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers. And lastly, we have Professor Bruce Robbins, the Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. His most recent books are Atrocity, A Literary History, it's forthcoming from Stanford in 2025, and Criticism and Politics, A Polemical Introduction, and The Beneficiary Duke. He's the director of two documentaries, quote, Some of My Best Friends Are Zionists, and What Kind of Jew is Shlomo Sand? The event outline will be that I'll give a brief introduction of our topic, and then I'll hand it over to our panelists who will each give an independent presentation. We'll move into a moderated Q&A where I will ask each individual some questions, and hopefully we have a robust discussion. And then for the last 20 minutes of the event, we'll open it up to an audience Q&A. So please be sure to input any questions that you have into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The topic today, we need to provide some context of where this is coming from. So following Hamas's surprise attack in Israel on October 7th, which resulted in the deaths of over 1,100 Israelis and over 200 being taken hostage, Israel launched another war in Gaza. This war, unlike those of previous years, has involved an unprecedented level of violence. Experts have noted that Israel's bombing campaign of the tiny strip, home to over 2 million Palestinians, has been the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs. Israel's bombing in Gaza has killed at least 40,000 Palestinians, including over 16,000 children. However, a journal article in The Lancet estimates that actual numbers could reach over 186,000. And the death count doesn't factor in the tens of thousands of Palestinian bodies that remain buried under the rubble. And there are hundreds of thousands who are injured and have no access to healthcare due to Israel's decimation of the healthcare system. In the midst of what many human rights experts and UN experts, along with the International Court of Justice, have described as a genocide in Gaza, American university students have begun organizing protests to voice their opposition to America's unconditional support of Israel. Many of these pro-Palestine voices set up encampments throughout the last year on their college campuses, calling on university administrations to divest from Israel. And the frequent response has been throughout almost the past year. University officials have calling in law enforcement to shut down, in many cases violently, these protests and demonstrations. There have also been actions taken by university administrations that have specifically targeted Muslim students. Earlier this year, USC canceled its pro-Palestinian valedictorian speech over quote unquote security concerns. There have been efforts to change policy, which have also severely impacted students and faculty's freedom of speech. There have been a long line of disturbing incidents that have occurred over the past year that have focused on suppressing and criminalizing these voices, including the doxing truck that went around Harvard and individuals having their job offers rescinded. And parallel to these actions is the increasing policing of speech, where any solidarity with Palestine or students calling attention to the genocide in Gaza has been smeared as supporting terrorism and/or anti-Semitic. Our panel today will address the critical issues of free speech, Islamophobia, and the challenges faced by pro-Palestine voices in academic institutions. The conversation will focus on the current state of academia and its role in promoting or stifling open dialogue on these issues. So I'm going to hand it off to our panel, and we'll begin with Professor Esposito.
Good afternoon. The terms Israel, Zionism, Judaism, and anti-Semitism are seen by many as intimately interrelated. As a result, to be critical of Israel, Israeli policies of apartheid, and the Israeli blockade of Gaza, or to denounce the Israeli genocide in Gaza, and more recently, the West Bank, today are often labeled as anti-Semitic. In contrast, too often Western policymakers, media, journalists, and many college and university administrators do not use the term Islamophobia to describe Israel's indiscriminate anti-Palestinian, Muslim and Christian Palestinians, policies, and the Netanyahu cabinet, Knesset, and IDF genocide of the vast number of innocent men, women, and children. Let's take a look at Islamophobia in Israel-Palestine and the Gaza war. The Hamas-led attacks of October 7 killed 1,200 people, resulted in another 250 Israelis and foreigners being abducted, according to Israeli tallies. It led to an Israeli government war in Gaza and more recently in the West Bank, which has resulted in 41,000 dead, approximately 70% of whom were women and children. The Israeli government's response drew on long-standing elements of Islamophobia since the so-called war on terror. How is this justified? It's justified by dehumanization of innocent Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, indiscriminate association of the religion of Islam and Muslims with violence and terrorism, ascribing a collective blame as if Muslims and Muslim communities were somehow complicit in terrorism and anti-Semitic violence. Sadly, I experienced a similar attitude post 9/11 when then Senator Joe Biden, chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, stated in a private briefing he had requested that American Muslims had been guilty of not responding quickly and publicly to 9/11. Quote, "Where are the Muslims?" he asked. "Why aren't they out there in the streets demonstrating and denouncing the 9/11 attacks or calling me?" Unfortunately, Biden's statement also revealed his ignorance about Islam and American Muslims' lack of significant political context at that time and political influence that, in contrast, many Christian and Jewish leaders and organizations have had that would enable them to contact Biden and other prominent members of Congress and the U.S. government to explain their situation and concerns. The same kind of ignorance extended to congressional committees. For example, in an article in the Congressional Quarterly, chairs of committees that oversaw U.S. government security interests, that is, congressional committees, were asked, "Do you know the difference between a Sunni and a Shiite?" All agreed this was an important question. All answered incorrectly. Let's move to Gaza today. What has happened in Gaza is in part due to the international community and especially the U.S. government's foreign policy and failure to respond effectively to address Israel's continued absorption of Palestinian territory, the Golan Heights, the spread of illegal Jewish settlements and seizure of Palestinian lands, Israel's gifting of Arab lands to Jewish settlement movements, and as a result, the creation also of an apartheid state. Netanyahu and his ultra-Orthodox far-right religious cabinet colleagues have used the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, to support their anti-Palestinian Islamophobic rhetoric and policies, portraying Palestinians, the majority of whom are innocent victims, as well as less valuable than other human beings, denying their political, legal, and human rights. They have supported and legitimated the demonization of Palestinians by claiming the authority of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, portraying Palestinians as the Amalek, a rival nation of the Jews' archetypal enemy, as seen in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3, one of the Bible's most violent passages. The prophet Samuel tells Saul, "This is what the Lord Almighty says. I will punish the Amalekites and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkeys." Netanyahu cited this passage of scripture to justify a policy and actions that have increasingly been labeled by many in the international community as genocide and war crimes. In fact, often, I think the exact phrase he used in one of his conversations was to talk about sort of human/animals in terms of the interpretation. Now, let's take a look at Hamas. Too often, media coverage and political analysis of Hamas has overlooked the fact that Hamas has been both a political movement governing and dealing with Israel's embargo or blockade of Gaza, as well as a military wing or militia. This distinction has too often been overlooked, with the term Hamas seen as an entirely militant movement. In the current war in Gaza, anyone who belongs to or is associated with Hamas politically is seen as responsible by many for the October 7 killing and kidnapping of Israelis, actions committed by a group of Hamas militants. Little distinction is made between the political and military wings of Hamas. Thus, the vast majority of Gaza's Palestinian Muslims today are not members of Hamas military wing or militia. Netanyahu and his followers ignore this distinction in their all-out war, killing and bombing of Gaza. Thus we see the disparity between the terrible number of people who were killed of Israelis, but the difference in that number, and then you jump to a number of 41,000, as I noted before, and this kind of attitude then somehow legitimates the disparity in terms of numbers and the level of violence that's being used. The US and many European governments and media have also often equated all pro-Palestinian demonstrations and organized opposition as anti-Semitic and supportive of terrorists. We see this most recently across the United States in terms of events on campus, as well as students demonstrating, etc. This, of course, challenges the right to free speech. Pro-Palestinian voices have been marginalized and their speech rights violated within academic settings. Today, reports, demonstrations, and statements, not just by the UN and major human rights organizations, but also by an enormous cross-section of people, countries, and organizations, have called for a ceasefire. Increasingly, many have come to refer to Israeli government policies and its military policies and actions as genocide. This call has fallen on deaf ears. As early as March 2024, an important statement was made by Francesca Albanese, UN expert and special rapporteur on human rights in the Palestinian territories, who concluded that Israel was committing acts of genocide in the Gaza Strip, which received broad support at the United Nations. As she said, when genocidal intent is so conspicuous, so ostentatious as it is in Gaza, we cannot avert our eyes. We must confront genocide. We must prevent it, and we must punish it. Today, we see a growing recognition not only by the UN and major human rights organizations, but also by a significant cross-section of countries and civil society organizations who have called what is happening in Gaza a war crime and called for a ceasefire. As we have seen, major protests and public demonstrations supporting the Palestinians of Gaza have occurred at more than 100 universities in the US, as well as in Canada, Europe, and Australia, and in some parts of the Muslim world, and in Israel at Hebrew University. Many have been accused of anti-Semitism. The US Congress has held sessions investigating and questioning university presidents, leading to the firing or retirement of a number of them. Students and faculty at some universities have been arrested and penalized by their university. In the US, a number of Jewish organizations like Jewish Voices for Peace and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice have been vocal critics of Israeli policies. Leo Ferguson, director of strategic projects and the lead author of the article Understanding Anti-Semitism, which was then published in The Forward, a major Jewish publication, concluded that, quote, protesters at Columbia are fighting for our deepest values as Jews. He continued, "Never before have the battle lines been so clearly drawn between those who countenance and enable mass murder and those who bravely demand a ceasefire, a full hostage exchange, and an equal future for Palestinians and Jews, during which we will never, ever again witness airstrikes during Ramadan or discover mass graves on the eve of Passover. I suspect that in the years to come, today's Colombia protesters and their cause will be regarded with the same respect as that of their forebears in the 1960s, referring to the period of the Vietnam War, anti-demonstrations, etc. But how many more will be dead by the time today's critics change their minds?" Close quotes. Equally important, in a letter from a group of 147 of American rabbis to President Biden and to Senator Schumer, the rabbis stated, "We write to express our gratitude for your leadership in safeguarding a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, grounded in a commitment to Israel's security and safety for Jews worldwide. Together, you have articulated a vision of Israel's present and future, which we believe is widely supported by American Jewry." And they concluded their statement with the following: "We agree that the only way forward is for Palestinians to govern themselves in an independent state alongside a secure and democratic Israel. This is the sole path towards ending the decades-long cycle of violence and bloodshed. Political leaders who stand in the way of fulfilling this goal are obstacles to ensuring Israel's security, protecting Jews globally, and ensuring a long-lasting U.S.-Israel relationship. Your forthrightness in addressing these obstacles is crucial to making progress toward a lasting peace." In conclusion, today we are at a major crossroads in the Middle East, in which the Netanyahu government has committed itself to a seemingly unending war in Palestine and now extended its military to a war, excuse me, epitomized by Netanyahu's threat to bomb Lebanon back into the Stone Age. Focus on the nature of the threats, particularly the perceived, alleged anti-Semitic ones. Are they general threats to what exactly have been a distraction from the real issue, which is the Biden administration's financial and military support for Israel? And sadly, thus far, the Biden administration, despite its drawing some lines vis-a-vis the Netanyahu government, not really stepping up in a way that it needs to and leading. Today, we need to sustain ongoing student, faculty, and grassroots movements in the US, Europe, and globally, and centers, think tanks, focus groups, conferences, and workshops. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Esposito. We have Professor Aziz on with us. I'm going to hand it over to her now.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you to the Bridge Initiative for inviting me to speak on this important topic. And I'm honored to be on the same panel with Professor Robbins and Professor Esposito. I'm going to use my time today to use a PowerPoint. And since I believe I'm the only lawyer on the panel, I thought I would use the opportunity to provide legal perspective on what's happening on college campuses, or at least I will say the legal backdrop, which we can then dig into during the Q&A. So let me just share my screen quickly. Give me a second here. I'd like to make 3 key points. The first is that American universities' missions plays a crucial role in upholding our democracy. And so we need to hold them to it, because it is not simply, or the adverse implications of failing in those missions is not simply affecting a particular body of faculty, but it is affecting the future of our democracy. Second, the corporatization of higher education that's been going on for a few decades now undermines the mission of American universities. And finally, I'll just do a primer on free speech rights and academic freedom and how they operationalize university missions. So let's just look at the 3 universities that the 3 of us represent, right? Georgetown, Columbia, and Rutgers. I did a quick search and to identify what they state is their mission. So if you look at Georgetown University, among, at least in the College of Liberal Arts, it states that it seeks to expand the imagination, foster the life of the spirit, cultivate lifelong learning, encourage service to God and humanity, and promote respect for diversity in an age of global community. It also seeks to provide a liberal education for young people who will be called to intellectual, moral, and professional leadership, and to foster them in them a lifelong commitment to the quest for truth. Rutgers University's mission statement is that it is a place that encourages free, open, and civil discussion, debate, and exploration of different ideas and viewpoints, a place where we strive to teach students how to think, not what to think, to excel in teaching, research, and service that requires that we engage in genuine curiosity and commit ourselves to understanding one another, even around the most difficult and divisive topics. And then finally, Columbia University, at least in their page on our values, states that we strive to educate future generations, create knowledge that will take humanity forward, and invest in community both locally and globally. Our mission cannot succeed without a commitment to thoughtful, rigorous debate that respects our collective rights to learn, work, live together, free of bigotry, intimidation, and harassment. So all of these are lofty mission statements, and they are in many ways tied to the ability for our society to continue being an aspiring democracy, and a democracy in process, because it is the students that come out of these universities, you can pick your mission statement, that ultimately end up being leaders in various capacities. However, I just took one of the growing number of books that are writing about the corporatization of education, and this one is The Universities in the Marketplace, the Commercialization of Higher Education, which was published by Princeton in 2004. There is a really important warning sign or warning in it, which is that today's educational institutions are busily striving to profit from teaching, research, and all the other activities on campus, offering corporations the right to endow professorships, sponsor courses, bring the university's scientific discoveries to market, and even advertise in the campus bathrooms. So no longer is the goal of many of these universities, whether private or public, to create an environment where students are committed to learning, professors are committed to educating, and researchers are committed to following their intellectual passions rather than the administrators' corporate agendas. And universities get embroiled and obsessed with playing the ranking game, which then turns universities into country clubs competing for the best amenities, not the best education as measured by the quality of research, the quality of pedagogy, and the ability of their students to be critical thinkers based on their ability to actually learn and act on what they're learning. University administrators also focus more on building a brand to sell their quote-unquote product, as opposed to educating thoughtful, critical thinkers with knowledge and courage to challenge systems that are contributing to catastrophic global problems, one of which is the genocidal campaign that's happening in Gaza by Israel, with $24 billion of our money. Education also creates an administrator class whose very highly paid jobs are to, again, protect the brand and police the faculty and students for one purpose, which is to raise money from donors and educate and increase revenues needed to expand the country club's amenities. And education is merely a widget to be sold, no different than other consumer products. And faculty are merely employees of the administrator class, not the intellectual backbone of the university's mission. So, against that backdrop, you are now seeing students who are attempting to be critical thinkers and who are attempting to challenge some systems and who are attempting to be thoughtful and not simply conformist robots to a corporate agenda. And students do that in various ways, whether it's in the classroom, outside the classroom, but in one way, which is a very common American tradition, they're doing it through public-facing advocacy, protests, sit-ins, encampments, and other, again, forms of very publicly facing activism, which anyone who's familiar with American university the history of it, that is very common. It's also common in other countries. We saw it with Bangladesh recently, with many of the university students. We've seen it in China. We've seen it all over the world. So let's start with the very first amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Just a little reminder. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So now one thing I will just remind everyone is that only public universities are subject to the U.S. Constitution. The state constitutions apply to public institutions and government institutions. However, when students or when private parties go to courts to seek judgments or to enforce some form of injunction or monetary remedy, that is considered state action. So to some extent, private universities may be implicated. However, again, going back to the university mission, that even if the university decides that it does not want to adhere to the First Amendment voluntarily, it can be undermining its mission. And if it uses the courts to enforce something, enforce some kind of speech-related regulation, then that could be considered state action. But I'd like to focus today just primarily on the 4 ways in which at least public universities can engage in some form of speech-related regulation. So first, content-based regulations as a general matter are usually found to be unconstitutional, with very few exceptions if they meet the strict scrutiny test, and that is usually a very difficult judicial test to meet. So what we rarely deal with, and what we're not dealing with right now, is content-based regulations. In other words, universities have competent general counsel, and they're telling them, you cannot issue a policy that says pro-Israeli students can protest and students critical of Israel cannot protest. That is not what we're dealing with. What we're really dealing with is content-neutral regulations. But if there is content-based regulations, there is one exception, which is fighting words. So if you can show that someone's content, that someone's speech are creating clear and present danger, then that could be content-based regulation. All right, and then I'll talk about time, place, and manner. So fighting words are very utterance, inflict injury, or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas, and are of such slight social value as a step to truth that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. And words which produce a clear and present danger are unprotected and are considering fighting words. But words which invite dispute and even cause unrest are protected and are not considered fighting words. So you must be inciting harm, imminent harm to specific people, not simply inviting dispute or causing unrest or discomfort or a sense of offensiveness. And the First Amendment prevents government from punishing speech and expressive conduct merely because it disapproves of the ideas expressed. So even if you have an administration that has openly stated that it is pro-Zionist, that it is Zionist, it is pro-Israeli, cannot prevent and punish speech and expressive conduct of students or faculty or staff simply because it disagrees with those ideas. Now, as a result, viewpoint discrimination is illegal, but viewpoint discrimination in content-neutral contexts could be where the law, even though content-neutral, is designed or operates in favor or disfavor of a particular point of view. So it may be facially neutral and valid, but that cannot save a law that is based on the desire to suppress a particular point of view. And that's that is in what we are seeing at many universities. They are seeking to suppress the pro-Palestinian or the critique of Israel point of view. So a regulation or policy that singles out particular speakers in its enforcement may be aimed at restricting certain content or certain viewpoints. Similarly, a regulation that restricts only a particular form of expression may be aimed at suppressing a particular viewpoint, maybe an encampment or a protest as a point to a different form of expression. And a facially neutral law may be viewpoint-based if, in operation, it restricts or promotes a particular viewpoint. So that discriminatory enforcement of a content-neutral law may still violate the First Amendment because enforcement involves government action subject to the First Amendment. And then finally, you are seeing many universities who are imposing time, place, and manner restrictions, which the Supreme Court has found is permissible if it's a content-neutral law, so long as those restrictions are only an incidental burden on speech. And if it furthers an important or substantial government interest, and if the governmental interest is unrelated to the suppression of free expression, and that usually the government interest that the public schools will state is the ability for students to go to school, to attend class, not to feel, to be in an environment that is conducive to learning and not disruptive. If the incidental restriction on alleged First Amendment freedoms, however, is no greater than is essential to the furtherance of that interest, right? It must adhere to that. Now, the key here is whether the restrictions on time, place, or manner of the protected speech are reasonable, right? So the restrictions must be justified without reference to the content of the regulated speech and that they are narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. And also there must be open, ample alternative channels for communications of that information. So let's look quickly at, let's apply that to what we're seeing today. I would posit that many of these new rules that were passed over the summer in haste with no faculty input in nearly every case, while everyone was away for the summer, impose unreasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner of free speech and expressive activities. For example, protests are permissible only on the margins of the campus, out of sight, out of hearing. There's limited time periods to protests that minimize the number of people exposed to the protest. There are restrictions on sound, banners, and tools used in protests, and they require permits in advance to provide the university an opportunity to prevent the protest, if not outright deny the permit, and usually in pretextual, non-content-based terms. And there is often no ample alternative channels for communicating that information. And the information that we're talking about today is information that critiques the state of Israel, that critiques foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy, that decries the Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza, and that demands a ceasefire. So you're also seeing censoring events, centers, and speakers. The administrator class is succumbing, this is part of the corporatization of higher education as well, succumbing to donors, alumni, and external American Zionist organizations demanding that they cancel events hosting Palestinian speakers or experts who are critical of Israel's genocidal campaign. And they are also denying students alternatives for collective mobilization to communicate their opposition again to Israeli actions, U.S. foreign policy, and the genocide of Palestinians. So I'll just put this slide to show you the disparate treatment that I think could make a case for viewpoint-based discrimination or content-based laws that are enforced discriminatorily. What you are seeing is universities favor Jewish students over Muslim and anti-Palestinian students. In what way? You see anti-Semitism task forces, which I support, but no anti-Palestinian racism task forces, very few Islamophobia task forces. You're seeing universities issue public statements expressing empathy for Jewish students, but no similar statements expressing empathy for Palestinian students whose families are being killed in Gaza and still being killed, and that has been the case for nearly a year. Universities are not recognizing or caring for Palestinians who feel trauma or offense when protests that defend Israel's genocide in Gaza hurts them. They have no feelings. They are not treated with the same humanity and empathy. And there's no harassment of Jewish and Zionist activist students by the university administrators, while there is harassment and punishment of Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim student activists who, again, are seeking a ceasefire and seeking an end to the Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. Now, neither should be harassed or punished, but what we're seeing is only one side is. You're seeing the policing of Muslim and Arab professors while allowing pro-Israeli professors full leeway to exercise their academic freedom rights, which includes support for Israel. You're
Sorry,
also saying,
could we just a couple more minutes, because I want to
Okay.
make sure we give time to Professor Robbins.
okay. And then finally, you're seeing silence when Muslim, Palestinian, and Arab professors are targets of smear campaigns and tortious demands to fire them by American Zionist organizations, as opposed to universities coming to their aid, speaking out against such smear campaigns and defending their Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian students. So I will just end here and You can read this report. I'll talk more about it in the Q&A, presumptively anti-Semitic, Islamophobic tropes in the Palestine-Israel discourse. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Professor Aziz. I'm going to hand it over to Professor Robbins now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I would like to say amen to everything that the two previous panelists said. I am very honored to be on the same roundtable with both of them. And picking up a little bit from where Professor Aziz left off, for those of you who might be looking for a kind of easy resource, there's a thing called the Chicago Principles, which are easy to find and which speak directly to the issue of time, place, and manner restrictions. This may seem too concrete, but I think it's in the right spirit. So the Chicago Principles, look them up. They're really easy to find. A lot of universities have signed on to them. So you can kind of stick it in the face of your administration. You believe in this and therefore blah, blah, blah. The university may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of expression to ensure that it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression. And it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. So what you can say when people apply these time, place, and manner restrictions, and they believe me, they've been doing it, is, okay, you've signed on to these Chicago Principles, that's what it says, and maybe you should back down. Sorry, I just had to piggyback on that because I think it is a useful resource and happens to be a useful resource here. All right, I've written something out, which will sound too written, but that's the way it is. So, Voices Under Siege. That's the title that gathers us together. And I think it's a very well-chosen title. At Columbia, where I am sitting right now, it is no understatement to speak of a siege. Anyone trying to enter the campus has to pass through a security check. Last week, I had an invited lecturer stopped at the gate. I managed to talk him in, but it was lucky I had left time for phone calls just in case. And ironically, his lecture was about the history of racism, considered from the point of view of security. This is not the time to go into detail, but the argument is very relevant to our concerns. He's interested in working out a concept of racism that will be relevant not just to racism tied to visible characteristics, like the US color line, but also invisible or disembodied characteristics seen as threatening, as is the case, he argued, for both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And here might like to make a pitch for Professor Aziz's argument about the racialization of religion in, I don't know, her latest book, or possibly not her latest book. In any case, one of her books. So, have a look. When I went into class this morning, tried to get into the classroom where I was teaching, as is frequently the case, you swipe to get in, and somebody will swipe and then open the door, and then a bunch of people will get in so as to make it a little easier for everybody to get in. And I tried to do that, and I was stopped by the security person and told to wait and swipe. And the clear reason for this is that they're assembling information on who's on campus, and they're using it as evidence in cases against students in particular. And they want to make sure that all the swipe information available to the computer people is there to be used in possibly punitive purposes. So to return to the Columbia siege, it has meant the addition of new security cameras, the hiring of a security firm of private investigators who've been authorized to knock on the doors of suspected protesters and threaten them with consequences if they fail to comply. For your future reference, this particular firm is called Renaissance Associates. No doubt they were inspired by the rebirth of democratic thinking in the Renaissance. I do doubt whether Columbia is the only school that is resorting to such firms and such tactics to deal with what they're calling disruptive behavior, or what we might call the use of our freedom of speech and the practice of moral scrutiny of the world around us, something that is presumably part of the university's mission to encourage. This past spring, the Columbia administration ignored its own rules of university conduct, bypassing the university senate, which is in charge of these rules, in order to restrict protests to given times and places and manners, and to institute new disciplinary procedures. As you will perhaps have heard, people have been paying attention to Columbia these months. The local chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace were suspended for breaking the new rules, whereas pro-Israel counter-demonstrators were not so disciplined. So sides had been chosen. Why? Well, I think it's the Palestine exception. After Columbia's former president, Minouche Shafik, testified before Congress on April 17th, it seemed clear that the reason was the administration's desire to do whatever the Republicans on the committee wanted. If the committee says there's an epidemic of anti-Semitism on Columbia's campus, then yes, there's an epidemic of anti-Semitism on Columbia's campus, and our job is to wipe it out. We need that federal money, even if the result is promising to fire faculty members, this happened, to whom the Republicans object, and joining into what would have to be called a new McCarthyism. Academia's complicity in the old McCarthyism, I hope there are people who know what that is taught as a shameful episode in the history of the 20th century. But that's no guarantee that academic leaders today will not participate in a new McCarthyism, especially aimed at untenured faculty and staff who are not protected by academic freedom. As a Jew, I always have my antennas up for possible signs of anti-Semitism, which is a real thing. And I'm constitutionally averse to trading in arguments that give even the appearance of anti-Semitic stereotypes. In this case, however, it is necessary to say, I say it a bit reluctantly, that another obvious reason why Columbia took sides against the critics of the Israeli slaughter in Gaza is that wealthy Jewish mega-donors told them to. No doubt they were saying such things in private, but in this case, they went ahead and said them in public as well. There's a New Yorker article by Andrew Morantz that quotes published comments by two of those donors. My own feeling going through all this was that yes, President Shafik should resign, as indeed she did, after the Faculty of Arts and Sciences voted no confidence in her by a 2/3 margin. But this was not enough. It allowed the Republicans on the committee to count this as a victory. It allowed them to get rid of another woman president. It would have been better if the trustees had also resigned. Trustees chosen in large part, let us not forget, because they too were mega donors. So here I'm chiming in with Professor Aziz's corporatization theme. Thanks to the Senate stepping up this summer, I'm happy to be able to announce that the Columbia administration's interim demonstration policy no longer exists. The Senate asserted its authority where it indeed had authority, legitimate authority granted it after the protests of 1968 at Columbia. And over the summer, it came up with a set of guidelines supplementing the existing rules and denying the administration, for example, the right to suspend people for months without first finding them guilty of anything. Punishment without a finding of guilt is not a good precedent. Getting rid of the interim demonstration policy was a victory, but it's a small victory in a battle that is very much ongoing. For what it's worth, I personally have been made the object of an investigation by Columbia's Office of Equal Opportunity. The charge is holding one class inside the encampment on April 22nd. It was a course on atrocity. And atrocity in Gaza had been on the syllabus since January. The students were told that no one should enter the encampment who did not feel comfortable, and that there would, of course, be no consequences for anyone who didn't enter the encampment. It doesn't seem that the administration has much of a case. And as tenured faculty with a lot of seniority, I'm probably in no danger personally. Still, they are doing this to as many people as possible. And many of those other people are much more vulnerable than I am. The pro-Israel lobby is extremely well organized and well financed. And they have hit on a smart tactic, taking the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, a commitment born of real disadvantage, and weaponizing it on behalf of Jewish students who are not, in fact, disadvantaged. Students who are largely complaining about nothing more than criticisms of Israel and how those criticisms of Israel make them feel. To identify criticisms of Israel with anti-Semitism, as Columbia's official task force on anti-Semitism has done, is having, and is clearly intended to have, a chilling effect on free speech. It is helping to propagate a culture of fear. It is doing its part to place our voices under siege. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. That was of such a informative, also quite disturbing and scary of what the current climate is on American universities. For our audience, I've seen that we have quite a number of questions. Please go ahead and ask more. I'm just going to have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask to each of our panelists just to expand on some of the stuff we've covered. Professor Esposito, how does the labeling of pro-Palestine activism as, quote, violent or divisive or, quote, extreme reinforce stereotypes and anti-Muslim stereotypes? And how do these impact Muslim students on university campuses?
Well, I think that, it's the level of sensitivity and the issues as underscored by both my colleagues put students, but also put faculty in a difficult situation. Now, especially junior faculty, I believe that those of us that are senior faculty have an obligation to say what we think, to say what we believe. But I think that what it does is it reinforces a climate in which, your average student, especially if they're in a university that's already acted in a way that makes it very difficult for them, but also for those who are on one campus, but look at another campus and say, my God, this could happen at my campus. If my administration hasn't already done it, it may well happen. And I think that I certainly know in talking to some students that there is a concern that stepping out front will create a vulnerability that is it really worth it? And that's also true for junior faculty. Remember also, this is just a practical consideration. Jobs in academia for many junior faculty are really important, and jobs for those who cannot get that kind of job, but are among the many who teach part-time. To think about the fact that you might, without even being addressed, by an administrator, that you just might not be renewed, is intimidating. And I think that's the environment we're in. And for those of us that are senior, I mean, nobody likes to be called anti-Semitic. And, and that word is used just very, very freely, especially not only when you deal with Palestinians, it can be very, very freely when you deal with academics, depending on on the position that they're taking. It is not uncommon to be, for example, called the protector of terrorists, etc. If you wind up defending the rights of Islamic movements that participate within the system, or when it comes to being critical of Israel. The one hope that I have, it seems to me that Netanyahu is totally out of control. And what we see now is, and it's going to be important in terms of U.S. policy, what Netanyahu is doing every day is saying, I can go in and invade both Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon and do whatever I want to do. If you look at the body count of the number of people that are being killed, and being killed in order to do what? To protect what? To address what?
Thank you, Dr. Esposito. Thank you for that. Professor Robbins, my next question is to you, and I think you touched on this a bit. We've seen a wave of censorship, intimidation, firings, and restrictions targeting pro-Palestine voices, and we've really seen a lot of the intimidation happening at Columbia University. And you described some of this basically surveillance techniques that are being employed. How has the conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism impacted pro-Palestine voices, and what are the long-term consequences when it comes to free speech and academic freedom when we're seeing these accusations of anti-Semitism used to shut down pro-Palestine advocacy or shut down debate and conversation in general?
Yeah, well, you kind of answered your own question the way you asked it. That's exactly what's happening. The shocking thing for me, maybe because I'm naive about university administrations and their commitment to their own mission, is that they have stood behind at Columbia their so-called task force on anti-Semitism, which is chaired by 3 people who are extremely out Zionists and have no expertise whatsoever in the history of anti-Semitism, and have very little idea, I mean, even very little willingness to talk about controversies over what anti-Semitism is. And they have made extremely misleading and irresponsible statements. They've sent out 2 reports so far, both of which are embarrassing from the point of view of academic standards or even journalistic standards. I shouldn't say even, both academic and journalistic standards. And the administration doesn't seem to be willing to say, well, you know, maybe we should wait and see what the academic community has to say about these reports. No, they seem to be really, you know, saying this is our task force. And the fact that a task force was founded to deal with anti-Semitism and not with Islamophobia, just one of the many signs of the asymmetry here, which is a structural asymmetry. You know, there are people who are suffering and other people, I mean, Professor Aziz said this extremely well, whose feelings are just not taken into account. I don't think anybody's feelings should be decisive in all this. I mean, somebody's feelings being hurt should not, for example, you know, be taken as decisive evidence that there is anti-Semitism, because frequently, I said it and I'll say it again, all you're talking about is people feeling uncomfortable who are not used to feeling uncomfortable because they're not used to hearing Israel criticized. This is not anti-Semitism. The criticism of what the government of Israel, the military of Israel is doing is not anti-Semitism. I'll just say for what it's worth, and this may be leading things a bit astray a little bit, one of the things that I've gotten back when I've spoken about this stuff in public is it's anti-Semitic because there's a double standard. Terrible things are being done by other states, other nations. Why are you so concerned with Israel? And it's true that terrible things are doing, nothing quite as bad as the genocide in Gaza, I think, but terrible things are being done by other governments. They are not terrible things that are directly supported by the United States. So we as citizens and residents of the United States have a special responsibility to speak up against those things. This is no double standard. These are the things we are doing. They would stop if American support stopped. So it's not the same kind of responsibility, and there's no double standard toward Israel involved in this. This may be not what you were asking, but I appreciate the chance to say it anyway.
No, thank you. I appreciate, you know, any sort of commentary on this topic, because I know we can go in so many different directions, and it is a vast topic. So I think any sort of information analysis anyone can provide is always beneficial for our audience. I'm going to move on to Professor Aziz, and you mentioned this at the end of your slideshow. It was a November 2023 report that Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights published, titled "Presumptively Anti-Semitic Islamophobic Tropes in the Palestine-Israel Discourse." Can you tell us a little bit about this report and accusations, again, of anti-Semitism are weaponized by anti-Palestinian voices, and how this plays into promoting Islamophobia? Because I think often that last portion is ignored of how it plays a role into promoting Islamophobia.
Well, one way, the primary manner in which one can ascertain if discrimination is happening is when you compare two groups of people that, at least as a matter of law, have the same rights, but in practice, one is being denied those rights or is not able to exercise them to the same full extent. And what caused us to write this report, and it was co-authored by me and Mitchell Plitnick, who is Jewish American, was that each time a Muslim professor, an Arab professor, a Palestinian professor, and about 20% of Palestinians are Christians. They're not all Muslim, but they're often presumed to be Muslim. And similarly, the majority of Arabs in America are Christian, although they're presumed to be Muslim. So when I say Islamophobia, I am talking about everyone who is either in fact or presumed to be Muslim, correctly or incorrectly. And what we found was that every time they were engaging, especially within their expertise, in criticism of Israel, whether it's in a geopolitical analysis or whether it's in US foreign policy analysis or whether it's in discussing Zionism and its history and critiquing it, that the response would not be on the merits, the disagreement, but it would be ad hominem attacks against the speaker, alleging that they were anti-Semitic as a way to shut down that conversation and discredit the expert. And it kept happening so frequently, and it was very clear that there were multiple Zionist or American Zionist organizations who are very well resourced and are very proud of their advocacy campaigns to defame Muslim, Arab, Palestinian professors, to smear them, to intentionally seek to get them fired, which is arguably potentially a tort and a violation of civil law and their rights, and did it with absolutely no hesitation. And we thought, okay, this is discrimination. And it's discrimination in twofold. First, it's denying the Muslim Arab professor and expert's right to speak and engage in the conversation in the public discourse, whether it's in an academic context or a non-academic context, in a way that isn't imposed, those restrictions or censorship or chilling of their speech isn't happening to the pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist experts who not always, but often are also Jewish Americans. And it is doing so, adding a double injury by perpetuating the stereotype, right, that, well, of course, their motivations for criticizing Israel is because they're anti-Semitic, because, well, everybody knows that Muslims are presumptively anti-Semitic. Everybody knows that Muslims hate Jews. That is an Islamophobic racist trope. So is the stereotype that Muslims support Hamas, that Palestinians support Hamas, that Arabs support Hamas, which is a designated terrorist organization. To presume that, to accuse them of that, is an Islamophobic racist trope. It is the same and equivalent from our vantage point as Muslims. It is the same and equivalent to telling a Jewish person, well, your people control the world, don't they? Well, your people must control all of the world finance. Well, right, you're not loyal to this country. All sorts of anti-Semitic racist tropes. It is unacceptable to say those things to someone who is Jewish simply because you disagree with them, or to say it at all. And yet we are constantly being accused of being anti-Semitic, of being terrorist supporters, of Hamas supporters by our colleagues, by the media. And administrators are silent, or sometimes they even say it themselves. So we're not even receiving the same amount of protection in terms of not wanting to be subjected to smear campaigns. And that's the faculty, right? They're privileged. The students are are much, much more vulnerable. So what Mitchell and I did is we wrote this report to try to really confront this head on and educate people that when you hear someone call a Muslim anti-Semitic on account of their critique of the nation state of Israel or the military action of Israel or the laws of Israel, you need to be very careful and scrutinize what are the facts that underlie that accusation. And if the only facts there are is, again, a political critique, then that's a racist trope, and we should call it out for that. And that is not also a very informed and educated way to have a debate. And so this is a weaponization of anti-Semitism, and it's intentionally a way to silence any criticism of Israel while further marginalizing, racializing, and denying the rights to Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians in American society and in American academia. And so it really saddens me that it is organizations and individuals who claim to be seeking to protect Jews from harm that are doing so in a way, and I think it's disingenuous because they're doing so in a way with the clear motivation of harming Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians.
Thank you, Professor Aziz. When you were talking about that, another example that came up is what happened actually in the Senate Judiciary Committee last week when Senator John Kennedy, I believe, attacked one of the witnesses, the only Arab American witness, Maya Berry, who was there to talk about the rising hate crimes against Arabs, Muslims, Americans, and he accused her of being supportive of Hamas, Hezbollah, and used all of these tropes that you talk about in the report. So I've put the link in for our audience to check out the report as well.
And I just want to add one thing. Why didn't Senator Kennedy get censored? Rashida Tlaib got censored, CNSURED, by her colleagues because she was at a protest where she stated from the river to the sea and explicitly said what I'm talking about. What I mean when I say that is Jewish security and freedom alongside Palestinian security and freedom. That's what I mean. And yet she got censored. And Senator Kennedy, nobody's talking about it in the media. There's no censorship. And the messages to Muslims, Arabs, and Palestinians, it's okay to be Islamophobic at the highest level of government. Anyone who wants to understand the history of anti-Semitism, go study the early 1900s in America. And you will see exactly the same type of behavior, but it's the Jews that are targeted. And that's how perverse this entire contemporary era is.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to, we have quite a few questions from our audience. This one isn't to any one particular person. If anyone wants to take this question, or if all of you want to take this question, please feel free. Could any of the panelists speak to the NYU decision to highlight Zionism or Zionists specifically as a protected view or class? Does that have precedent, and do you feel it could reasonably withstand challenges?
I'm happy to just talk about it. I'm not surprised at all about it. So effectively what's happened is it starts out that the ultimate objective, right, is to silence any critique of Israel and to silence any efforts to change U.S. foreign policy in terms of its provision of billions of our dollars to Israel. And whatever those efforts are, whether they're supporting BDS, whether they're protests, whether encampments, pick your tactic, but that's the ultimate objective. So it began, right, what we saw the last year was the primary strategy was calling those people anti-Semitic, right? But when it became clear that a large number of those people were Jewish that were criticizing Israel, a large number of those students who were leading in the protests and who were in the encampments were Jewish, it became a little bit more difficult for that weaponization to have any salience. So, and also I think to the credit of the students, they also appreciated that this isn't about Jews or Judaism. This is about a political ideology of Zionism, right? And so they started to be careful with their words to say, we are criticizing the political ideology of Zionism that informs, animates, and justifies Israeli war crimes and international and genocide. Not that all Zionists agree with that, but they were just tying that ideological commitment with that military action. And so you're seeing now a switch that is responding to that and saying, well, wait a minute, you can't do that because anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, bringing it back to anti-Semitism and imposing a very narrow, specific interpretation of Zionism that not all Jews agree on. And it is flattening the the Zionism as an ideology. There's a rich history. And many Jews were anti-Zionist before the Holocaust. Many Arab Jews were anti-Zionist before 1948. It's a complicated and interesting history. But if you flatten it and make it very reductive to a very specific perspective of, well, if I believe that Israel is my homeland as a religious belief, and you oppose that belief in any way, or even it could be supporting a two-state solution, meaning you don't get all the land, that's anti-Semitic, and now we're in discrimination territory. And once we're in discrimination territory, we're going to leverage all of these laws that are anti-discrimination laws, which then puts to the side and dismisses any type of free speech or academic freedom arguments. So it's a strategic ploy, because if you want to combat anti-Semitism, then you combat anti-Semitism, which is where you have specific individuals that are harassed, that are bullied, that are physically assaulted because they're Jewish, right? And that is unacceptable. But if you look at the encampments and you look at the protests, who are they criticizing? A nation state.
Do you mind if I just add a little bit to that? I promise I'll make it
Yes,
really,
please go ahead, Professor Robbins.
just
Please do.
to underline the insanity of it. It's just to say the same thing, really. Before World War II, it's pretty sure historically that the majority of Jews would be anti-Semitic by this definition, because the majority of Jews were not Zionists. I mean, that is how crazy this has become, that the people who think they can redefine anti-Semitism this way are telling enormous numbers of Jews. I mean, probably 40% of the people who are really critical of what's going on in Gaza, in the Jewish community, they're calling them anti-Semitic. The Columbia administration outlawed Jewish Voice for Peace, just brought up charges against one of my students because she was tabling for Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an illegal organization on our campus, right? This is what the Columbia administration, how the Columbia administration is defining anti-Semitism. The NYU people have just gone that one extra little step. You could say, rhetorically speaking, it's the desperation of people who know they cannot defend genocide. All they can do is call the people who are calling out genocide anti-Semites. If you don't have any other argument to make, you try to discredit the people you're arguing with.
Thank you, Professor Robbins, and thank you, Professor Aziz, for that response and for that history. I think that history is very important to know. This is I find this a really interesting question, and I think I'm going to open up to everyone again. I'll ask Professor Esposito first. This individual asks, I'm curious how we think universities will frame themselves around the Palestine genocide in retrospect. Maybe they'll claim they challenged it or say they did the right thing by being, quote, neutral. How do you think universities in the future, how do you think they'll frame themselves and present themselves when I guess everything comes out about what has been going on in Palestine? Professor Esposito, I'm going to hand that over to you first.
Yeah. The fact is that human nature being what it is, the desire to be seen as, true to the mission of a university, the concern about fundraising, there'll be an attempt in the future on the part of some to kind of whitewash what they did. My concern is I don't see that future being very proximate. I just don't. I mean, I think that it has already gotten out of control, and I was dealing with a situation where a very prominent academic spoke, who ran a major center at a major university, spoke to the president of the university just before graduation about what should not be done in terms of moving against student demonstrators, et cetera. And the president, who was seen as in general in the relationship, very amenable, seemed to be amenable. And then right after that, at the graduation speech, he basically announced just the opposite. And for me, the concern is if you listen to my two colleagues, The concern is that some of the universities that have been the most outrageous are among our top universities in the country. You know, it's not like saying you've got some marginal small colleges in certain kinds of communities that are doing what they're doing. And then you say, well, we should address it, but you don't see it as a real threat to the profession and a threat in terms of the integrity, of our educational system. But I mean, you start ticking off the names of places, and you're talking about Columbia and NYU, Berkeley. I mean, you just go on and on and on. And in fact, I would almost say, I have to be careful how I word this. I would almost say that those universities that have not really had the kind of reactions that have occurred, that is, in terms of what students have done on their campuses, I think then there's a question mark there on why that's the case. Is it a comment about the administration, a comment about fear of administration, or is it a comment about students and faculty there? So I'm not optimistic on this one. And unfortunately, it's all plugged into, something that's not going to go away in the near future. Not only in terms of the Netanyahu government, but this builds on the whole anti-Palestinian approach. When I became an academic, I believed that in my lifetime, I would see peace in Palestine. I gave a talk recently at an organization in Texas that I had launched 20 years ago. And I had to give a talk in general, but at the end, I knew I had to address Palestine because they wanted me to. And I addressed it and said exactly what I said to you. And I used to say, thank God I'm not going to be like a scientist that works on a form of cancer, his or her life, and then retires and hasn't, seen it addressed. Well, in this audience, I was able to say, I spoke here 20 years ago. I'd like you to invite me back 20 years from now. I'll only be 103, but I intend to stick around.
Thank you, Professor Esposito. Professor Robbins, I'd like to get your take on how academia in the future will address this, or how they will frame it.
I can't answer that as it deserves to be answered, but I can at least give anybody who might be on this Zoom now who's looking for an essay topic, a good essay topic. I would love for somebody to do the history of how 1968 at Columbia became something that Columbia started little by little. I don't know the details, but I'd love to read the essay about this, how Columbia became proud of itself over 1968 after, how shall I say, bringing in hundreds of cops and beating anyway, doing some serious violence against the protesters. And yet, now it's something that, it's like, history happened on this camp. Come to Columbia, a place that everybody pays, so much attention to. It's really a historic place. So there's a history there. It's, I'm sure it's going to be fascinating. I will recommend, give a little shout out to something I wrote. Emanuel Wallerstein, the sociologist, I don't know if anybody's heard of him, a founder of world systems theory, was a sociologist at Columbia in 1968. But he was faculty, right? He was not a student. And in 1969, he published a book called University in Tumult. I think it's Tumult, which is sort of about the events of 1968 as seen from a faculty point of view. Sympathetic, but faculty. I wrote something about this in the New Statesman. I was fascinated. I hadn't even known he wrote this book. It would be really interesting for people to have a look at now, because he tries to generalize a little bit about what you can and can't do with a university on subjects. Of course, now it would be Palestine, then it was Vietnam. Anyway, I just throw it out there.
It's very helpful, Professor Robbins. Professor Aziz, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, and seeing how academia in the future will frame its positions.
I think that we need to decide as a society what kind of higher education system we want. Do we want a university system that just produces cogs, or do we want and that are just conformists who don't think for themselves, who don't know how to do critical thinking and are just there to make their employers richer, which of course would be devastating for innovation. It would be devastating for creativity, especially in the arts and sciences. It would be devastating for critical thinking and for foreign policy. I mean, it's people come to the United States for higher education because they are free to think and free to research and free to engage and talk and engage in collective mobilization as long as it's nonviolent. So I would advise university presidents that are not at the elite schools, because I think the elite schools have been bought and sold. I would advise you to leverage the neoliberal capitalist system by making your university an academic freedom university, a free speech university. And you may start attracting some of the best students and some of the best faculty, or effectively refugees of these oppressive environments. And you may be able to be leaders in that area, because unfortunately, I think Professor Esposito is correct. The Ivy Leagues have demonstrated that they are underwhelming. They are a lot of talk and no substance, because when it's actually time to act on their missions and the students are holding them accountable, they cave into external interests that are not aligned with the university mission.
Thank you, Professor Aziz. This is my final question. And again, this is from an audience and it's open to anyone who wants to answer if each of you would like to give your thoughts. Do any of the panelists have thoughts about how to reconcile the volume and intensity of the international resistance to the genocide and war crimes in Gaza / the West Bank with the Biden administration's unwillingness to move their position in any form, even in the face of the upcoming clear cost to the election prospects?
I think it's predictable. I mean, I think President Biden will go down in history for his career in Congress and for a lot of what he's done in his term that in a lot of other areas. On the other hand, it's difficult to say, but the fact is he's been consistently in the wrong place when it comes to dealing with what, in fact, even now, even if he had he doesn't have any real significant learning curve when it comes to the fact that we've moved to the point where we have with the genocide. So one can understand why, given some of his background, he's talked about his background and interaction with Jewish community, his interaction with leaders in Israel, etc. But at the end of the day, on this issue, as bad as things have gotten, only a couple of weeks ago we did another shipment of to Israel. I mean, that is inexcusable. You have no credibility there, and not to call it. And he's put his vice president, I think, in a very difficult situation because she's been his vice president. One would hope that she's tried to send a little bit of a signal at the end of her a statement that she made at the convention, about being concerned about not only the plight of the Palestinians, but dealing with the reality of what Palestine and Palestinians had to become. But it could still, she's not going to go completely against Biden or in any way. And I think that can affect an element of the Muslim vote, where people might not vote, not realizing that the alternative is beyond belief. But I think that, I can certainly see where, people who've lost 30, 40, 50, 100 members of their extended family are Americans who are going to be sitting there and saying, what, and at least there's got to be a real promise that there's going to be, change.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Professor. Go ahead, Professor Robbins.
I'll make it quick. I'm naive enough or optimistic or stupid enough so that her not showing up for Netanyahu's speech and then putting the word self-determination, into her speech, we're thinking, I don't know, there's just some chance that she would be better. I kind of want to believe it. I can't say that I do believe it. But again, if I had lost all those members of my family, I really doubt that it would sway me, in her direction.
I think the policy on Israel is not made from the White House. It's made from Congress. And that while Biden is unique in being a very, very loyal kind of right-wing Zionist, and that way he stands out, but even if you were to get a president who was more centrist and a two-state solution person, someone who kind of a J Street type Zionist, opposed to Netanyahu, but not particularly pro-Palestinian. I think that Congress is, as we saw with AIPAC spending collectively $25 million to eliminate two Black progressive House representatives, Jamal Bowman in New York and Cori Bush in St. Louis, Missouri, which I think was a significantly anti-Black campaign, to remove these two African-American progressive leaders who are social justice minded, whose primary agenda was working with low-income Black communities and addressing and trying to rectify systemic anti-Black racism, and yet to spend an unprecedented amount of money to remove them in primaries was, that essentially says it all. That Congress is bought by special interest groups. It's not just AIPAC, there are other special interest groups on different issues. But this particular issue is, I think, one of the most egregious examples of congressional leaders. Their views, their analysis, their positions seem to be irrelevant. Because if they disagree, if they don't support unconditionally Israel, even when a genocide is happening, then they will lose their office. And to what extent can the president offset that? And that same thing affects the president, because you need a majority in Congress in order to be able to pass your political agenda on especially domestic issues. And so what we have is legalized corruption, and this is just one of the most egregious examples of the manifestation of why the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling was so damaging to our democracy. And we need to think about how do we change that structure, not just for the Palestine-Israel issue, but for any type of issue where the government is acting in a clearly counter-majoritarian way. The elected government, the representative government, is supporting war and genocide, while the majority of Americans want a ceasefire.
Thank you, Professor Aziz. I'm gonna close this here. I think we've had a very, very vibrant discussion on a very important topic. I'm going to thank each of our panelists for taking the time out and providing your important input and analysis. And I know I learned a lot. I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed this discussion. Please be sure to follow Bridge and the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights for upcoming future programs. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.